There was Slugger O'Toole, who was drunk as a rule, and Fighting Bill Casey from Dover. The words of the famous sea shanty, the Irish Rover. But online, Slugger O'Toole ain't drunk as a rule, he's right as a rule, because that's the name of the preeminent political blog of Northern Ireland. This week, I talked to the man behind Slugger O'Toole on the Alex Salmond Show, on air and online.
Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show on the day of the European elections in the UK. These are elections which were never meant to be, but which could now have significant political consequences. In next week's show, we shall examine how these are likely to unfold. However, today we continue our series on political bloggers. Last week we noted the success of the former ambassador Craig Murray in commanding a UK top 10 slot with a blog which concentrates on Scottish politics. This week, we interview another top blogger who has achieved that status with a blog which focuses almost exclusively on the politics of Northern Ireland. Mick Fealty hasn't lived in the province for the best part of 30 years, as his day job took him to England, and yet, for almost 2 decades, his blog has become the undisputed source of the best primary material for those who wish to navigate through the maze of the politics of Northern Ireland.
Because I don't live at home, I'm not too worried. I can be quite blunt and straightforward because I know I'm not going to get a knock at the door at 11 o'clock at night going, "Here, Fealty, what have you written that for?" sort of thing.
But first to your tweets, messages and emails, and the programmes on Craig Murray certainly caused a stir online. In addition to the worldwide television audience and on Alex's Facebook alone, the shows have already attracted more than 200,000 viewings. It was revelations such as this on human rights which had a major impact.
I decided that we had to go public on the human rights abuses that were occurring, including one instance of a gentleman being boiled to death. He was boiled alive, literally.
And here's what you had to say in reaction to both parts 1 and 2. J.R. Tomlin says, "I admit, even as a long-time follower of Craig Murray, that I didn't realise quite the depths of what he had gone through." Jill says, "What a man of integrity Craig Murray is. By the way, I read somewhere Alex Salmond Show has been getting more viewers than BBC Scotland shows." I read that too, Jill. Sam says, "Great interview, Alec. Keep up the good work, and thanks to Craig for speaking out." Elizabeth says, "There's hope for the world yet when people like Craig are not afraid to expose the rot and corruption in the British establishment. A great show." Finally, Beth says, "It was very laudable of then Ambassador Murray to try and stop other people doing things that are wrong, up to a point. We also have to try and live in peace with evil regimes, or else risk the often greater evil of war or other forms of conflict, which bring suffering on the innocent." Now, in 2002, an expatriate Northern Irishman contemplated what he might do to assist in a peace process which looked like it was in danger from political deadlock. He alighted on the idea of a blog to promote a book of conversations with key politicians. 17 years later, Slugger O'Toole's blog is read by everybody who is anybody in Northern Irish politics. Alex talks to the man behind the blog, Mick Fealty.
Now, I'm delighted to be joined by the man behind the wonderfully named blog, Slugger O'Toole. Mick Fealty, welcome to the Alex Salmond Show.
Thanks, Alex.
So, the first question is obvious. Why Slugger O'Toole?
Well, it started off as a letter to Slugger O'Toole. That was the full title of it. And Slugger O'Toole is a character out of a song, an old Irish song
called Irish Rover.
The Irish Rover. And the line in that song goes, it's a piece of nonsense, but it's great crack. The line goes, "Slugger O'Toole, who was drunk as a rule." And the original notion was that trying to explain Northern Ireland was a bit like trying to explain anything to a drunk man. You had to kind of divvy it up in small amounts. You had to be prepared to repeat yourself over and over, and you have to be prepared to take a very long time. Now, that was 17 years ago, and I have to say I didn't think it was going to take this long, but there it is. We're still going
So
strong.
how are you getting on? Are we we're ordering in the next round, or are you making good progress?
Well, you never know in Northern Irish politics when the next round's going to come, or indeed when the last round's going to be served. At the moment, it's pretty thin pickings. The Assembly's down now for 2 years, though wonderfully nobody else in the rest of the whole of the United Kingdom seems to have noticed. But, you know, there's always talks around the corner. Whatever falls over we do seem to be able to get it back up again.
What moved you to say, right, I'm going to start a blog and it's going to be Northern Irish politics?
I had considered getting involved in and around the time of the Good Friday Agreement. Things seemed to be getting exciting, but in a good way. This conflict had been going on for It's 1969, I was 10 years of age, and at 10 years of age, you don't know what's going on, except the place that you've grown up in that seemed to be the most boring political backwater that God ever invented suddenly became the focus of all this kind of world politics.
And where did you grow
conflict.
up? Tell me about your own background.
Well, I grew up in a small town outside Belfast called Hollywood, which was a mixed community. Very close to Belfast, and I mean so much so that when the bombs went off, you could hear it, but you could hear it at a distance. And we managed to some extent to have a relatively normal life growing up there. And I think from that kind of the shock onset of this thing going from complete peace to complete conflagration, I think there was a curiosity born in me at that very young age that I wanted to be part of a solution. And when the Good Friday Agreement came along, it seemed that the solution had arrived. But, you know, 5 years later, in 2002, things were beginning to unravel.
So would it be over-egging it to say it was your contribution to the peace process? Would that be a reasonable thing to say?
Well, it started off as a very modest contribution, but that's really what I wanted to do. Back in 2002, it seemed to me that we had two sets of parties on the dance floor. Well, one was on the dance floor. That was the nationalist section of the community, of which I grew up a part of. But it wasn't going to work unless unionists could find some confidence that they had a place in the future. So, in the first place, Slugger was really set up as a research tool for a paper that we were going to write on the future of unionism. But through that, it kicked off a conversation between both unionists and nationalists, which really started all those years ago. And, you know, June the 6th this year, it'll be 17 years since the first day that we began.
What are your key audiences? I mean, I saw a statistic saying that Slugger O'Toole was viewed regularly or very often or daily, perhaps by the minute, by 97% of the Assembly members in the Northern Irish Assembly. It begs the question who the other 3% were, incidentally, but we'll leave that to one side. So, in a sense, one of your key audiences wasn't there, it was in abeyance. So how did you establish the success of the blog, given that the analysis of the Assembly politics was one of the big strengths of it in that period?
I think in those first 4 years when there was no Assembly, and often there was no real contact between, say, the DUP and Sinn Féin, or that's what they told us publicly, very often their people would make contact through the comment zone on Slugger O'Toole. So that often they would fly kites, they would try this idea or that idea and test it, and if it got shot down quickly, then they'd readjust. Now remember, this is before Twitter, this is before Facebook, and in a way, that's why Slugger very quickly became a watering hole for that political class.
But much more civilised than Twitter, than tweeting, because it been one of the Slugger O'Toole founding principles. One, you had to play the ball, not the man.
Yeah. You know that old soccer rule that soccer players never pay any attention
None
to?
whatsoever.
But, you know, that was really to do with the fact that for the first 3 months of Slugger, when people were starting to talk, they were all quite polite with each other because they didn't know who each other was. And then after about 3 months, they decided that they figured out who they liked and who they didn't like. So I moved in with this idea of play the ball, not the man. Now, that's not just about taking out bad behaviour, it's also encouraging contact with the subject in hand rather than with each other. And that makes for much more engaging and interesting conversations. Sometimes it goes a little bit off the point, but we're a voluntary blog, you know, so nobody's paying for our time to make sure that the rule is observed.
Your dad was a publican, wasn't he?
He was
He ran
indeed,
a public house and all. Is there a way that the blog you created is like the best kept pub? An atmosphere where people can actually have animated discussion without anybody breaking the furniture?
Well, exactly. Although that is how I would like to think that my dear old dad, looking down from wherever he is, would look at it and understand that really it's an homage to him, or that old-fashioned Irish barkeep that spots trouble early on, that makes sure that people can have conversations. Okay, raise their voice every now and again, but nobody's in danger. Nobody's in danger of social ostracization or that one particular view. And I just think there's something around creating conviviality of space that enlarges possibilities rather than strangles them at birth.
Have you managed to walk that line all the time, or do in the deepest depths of the DUP, do they say, well, that's Slugger O'Toole, we all know about him, is really a shirrer by nature or background, or in the deepest depths of Sinn Féin, do they think you're a secret alliance supporter? Or basically, have you managed to get people to accept the blog for what it is? I
think people found it very difficult to begin with, to figure out exactly where I was coming from. I'm often not defensive of unionism, but unionism gets the thick end of the narrative generally in Northern Ireland. So there are times when I will deliberately go in and take a kind of a defensive line on certain things. And I think that's led some people to think that I was a soft or a moderate unionist. But what really confounds them is I'm also an Irish speaker. Through my own dad's family, he comes from Donegal. Granddad didn't speak a word of English, really. So there's a way in which, and also because I don't live at home, I'm not too worried. I can be quite blunt and straightforward because I know I'm not going to get a knock at the door at 11 o'clock at night going, here, Fealty, what have you written that for, sort of thing. So there's ways in which I've dodged being completely defined by the norms of politics in Northern Ireland. And I think, as I've sometimes laughingly said, sometimes the safest place to write about Northern Irish politics is from about 350 miles in a full Irish sea away. Because it aids not objectivity. I don't believe in objectivity. I've never believed that that's possible. But it certainly lends a certain kind of distance to how you see things. When I spend time at home, I inevitably get hooked on the emotional ups and downs of, kind of living and working in what is still a deeply sectarian society.
So you started fairly early on in the blog's development. You had this kind of like cross-party or cross-community panel of key writers. How did you pick them? How did you pick your team?
Well, the way everything's worked on Slugger is that sometimes you just get pushed into things by an emergency. So in that first summer, I just went off, took about a 2-week holiday, went off to Donegal, thought no more of it. A year later, we were cycling 1,000 readers a day. And I thought, I can't leave this thing just to fester for 2 weeks. People will get lost. More importantly, people will wander off and go somewhere else. So I just arbitrarily I asked for 6 people to come from different traditions, and whoever put their hand up, I accepted. Now, some of them really took to it really well and became part of the permanent team. Some of them wrote once, didn't like the reaction they got to their opinions, and never blogged again. But what that did was set the principle of Slugger O'Toole not being Mick Fealty, that it had to be a multiplicity of voices. And we've worked very hard recently since I've had my deputy editor, David McCann, on board to try and bring more women on board, to try and get unionists who, for reasons I still haven't figured out, are less likely to step up into the public space and express what their politics are. And I don't mean just in the new media space. I don't mean just with blogs or Twitter or Facebook. I think it's generally, you see in the commentariat in Northern Ireland, most of us, you had Eamon Malley here not so long ago, are people like myself and Eamon who basically come from a Catholic or nationalist background. But we've tried to work quite hard to get and to maintain some kind of unionist voice. And I think that multiplicity of voice is really important. And I think it's one of the reasons why Slugger's lasted 17 years.
Welcome back. Alex is interviewing top 10 political blogger Mick Fealty of the splendidly named Slugger O'Toole site. We take up the story with the Assembly re-established and the unlikeliest of political partnerships developing between Martin McGuinness of Sinn Féin and the Reverend Ian Paisley of the Democratic Unionist Party.
So let me take you on to 2007. So we have the St Andrews Agreement, and after a period of abeyance, we get the Chuckle brothers, the Reverend Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness get together as the First Minister and Deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland. Now, was that a boon for the blog? Or alternatively, you think, my goodness, they're now talking to each other, they won't need Slugger O'Toole?
It's a really good point. I certainly think at the time there were some of our readers who suggested that that was going to be the case.
So you'd achieved your mission. Well,
in a way, it was an interesting acknowledgement from some insiders that we had actually served a purpose and that they could no longer see what purpose we might serve now. We had an all-inclusive executive with, your viewers might probably not know this, but the cabinet or the executive in 2007 contained 4 different political parties. In other words, there was hardly anybody left outside the government. And so therefore, why did you need a blog? Why did you need to bring together all these opinions when they could talk over the cabinet table? Well, as it happened, it wasn't long before we had our first crisis, and Slugger was there to kind of, pick up the whole row over whether policing and justice powers would be devolved to Stormont, and we had 154 days of Sinn Féin not turning up to executive meetings, meaning that the executive meetings couldn't happen, meaning that no minister could actually conduct any executive business that meant the participation of more than just his own department. So we've had plenty to talk about ever since.
And yet, Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness got the show back on the road and had, by most accounts, a highly successful partnership, even to the extent that 2 people who had never shaken hands in public, ended up as very, very close friends. I think would be a reasonable way to put it, in private as well as public. Why is it that the current leadership of Sinn Féin and the DUP are finding that sort of relationship difficult? Were they 2 special people, or is it because politics have moved on, or perhaps peace is relatively established and therefore people don't sense the same urgency? Why can't you do that now?
Well, I think, look, the friendship, I think, was genuine. There's that old, I think, W.C. Fields, and if you can fake sincerity, you've got it made. But I think there was something very sincere in those 2, in that friendship. That was the chemistry was very special. But I think over and above that, they also both had a significance to their respective camps that reassured everybody. So the old IRA men were going, well, Martin's one of us. If he signed up with Paisley, then that must mean that it's okay. I remember interviewing Paisley's son, Paisley Jr., for a profile I did for Prospect magazine back in 2007. And he said, look, if my dad's name went on the final agreement, then that was okay for everybody to the right of the DUP.
Most people would say, observers would say, look, the story of Northern Irish politics over the last 20 years has been the rise of Sinn Féin, decline of the SDLP on the nationalist side, the rise of the DUP, decline of the official unionists on the unionist or Protestant side. But you don't quite see it like that. You think there are other things moving in the undergrowth of Northern Irish politics that perhaps the headline writers are missing.
I think so, and I think it comes down to something that was becoming obvious by the last Assembly election, the one that was, I call it the election to nowhere, because after it took place, we didn't have an Assembly because the deputy, Sinn Féin would not nominate a deputy First Minister. But it is the rise of the middle. People who no longer consider themselves to be Catholic or Protestant. People who live their lives in a kind of a post-conflict space that doesn't really need to be nationalist or unionist. And we see it most, I think, on the unionist side, where there's something like a 5.6% rise in the Alliance Party's vote. The Green Party doubled its councillors on Belfast City Council. And people before profit are beginning to challenge Sinn Féin in places where Sinn Féin are very uncomfortable being challenged, in the Citadel of West Belfast where Gerry Adams had his base, and Derry, where Martin McGuinness. And that I think is telling us that there are people who are really fed up with the whole virtue signalling of I'm a bigger nationalist than anybody else, or I'm a bigger unionist than anybody else. We've got a mental health crisis in Northern Ireland, which is directly related to our inability or unwillingness to deal with the real legacy of trouble, which is very often has its root in post-traumatic stress disorder. We have very high suicide rates amongst teenagers, and nothing's being done about all of that. And of course, it doesn't help. Austerity for the last 10 years hasn't helped. But not having any political agency in Belfast certainly hasn't helped either.
But surely the European issue has brought the constitutional issue back to the fore in a huge way. But it's brought the issue of the border back to the fore, and the placings of the various parties on Europe surely has created that very sharp delineation which perhaps have been blurred or becoming to be blurred. Surely Europe has pushed the constitutional issue of Ireland back to the top of the agenda.
Yes, it has created huge disturbances within the communities, that is for sure. There's been a lot of speculation about whether this will lead to United Ireland, and I'm sceptical. And I'm sceptical for this reason. And I'm not saying this because it's you, Alex, but I think what happened in Scotland provides signal lessons for Irish nationalism, in the sense that one of the issues that I think you tackled very successfully over the last 20, 25 years was the cultural resistance to the idea of Scottish independence. You know, taking it from a minority concern to something that at least the majority could contemplate. And because we keep falling back into this sectarian hole, where everything is delineated by identity and nothing can focus on the possibility of doing something different or something new or cutting the cloth in a different way, I think what is keeping Northern Ireland safely locked inside the United Kingdom is that culture war that has to be gone. If Irish nationalism has any chance of creating a United Ireland, it needs buy-in from the other side, and that's simply not happening.
But a younger generation, perhaps, certainly my experience recently in interviewing young people in Northern Ireland, they were impressed by the changes that are taking place in the Republic, by the move to a much more civil society, the progression to equal marriage, a variety of other rights. Some things which are not available in Northern Ireland. Isn't that making a difference? The resistance against, I mean, no one could seriously call the Republic a theocratic state anymore.
No, and it's changed quite a lot since I was growing up. I mean, the classic thing people used to do when they were going down for the All-Ireland GAA matches is to call in and stock up on contraceptives, because at the game.
From personal experience or just general?
No, this is anecdotal evidence from certain friends who were lucky enough to get down to go to the All-Ireland final in Dublin, and they'd take contraceptives with them so they could sell and pay their way, pay through the gate and all the rest of it, because it was illegal in the Republic.
It's a whole new dimension to the cross-border trade.
Yes, exactly. Technically speaking, that's smuggling, but you know, you could see it as a public service to our friends in the south. But now, you know, the Republic has some of the most advanced laws in terms of sexual preferences, marriage equality. When you think 1986, it lost a referendum to legalise divorce. That tells you how fast and how quickly and how far the Republic has moved. I think a lot of northern citizens, be they British or Irish, have taken a lot of reassurance from that. But the work of selling the idea of United Ireland has to be done in the 6 counties. It's okay that the Republic becomes more liberal than Northern Ireland, but there's another job of work that has to be done in the north, and that is to take away the fear or the sense of foreboding of what that is, and to create a sense of there's an opportunity here. And I think the fact that we have a politics which is still described by religious affiliation is putting severe limits on that, and those are limits that are going to have to be broken down in the next 10, 15, 20 years. The idea that Catholics are going to outbreed Protestants, it's not going to happen. Not because of anything other than the fact that there are, year after year after year, there are less Protestants, but they're also less Catholics. There are less people who define themselves by those terms.
So have you been tempted in this mission of civilised debate to carry it to Westminster, you know, to be the to be the antidote for certain other top 10 bloggers?
I think there's certain frontiers that are beyond even the remit of Slugger O'Toole, and I think trying to civilise Westminster is another kettle of fish.
Well, it may be a bridge too far, yeah. But I don't know if either of us are going to manage to civilise Westminster. But what I can do is present you with the Alex Salmond Quake for appearing in the show. So, Mick, with great pleasure. You know the drill. Oh, incidentally, one thing, no bush bill, only Scotch.
Well, I shall think of that as I'm drinking my whiskey with an E out of it. Thanks, Alex.
Great pleasure.
Let us dwell for a second on the extent of the achievement of the Slugger O'Toole blog. I've noted previously that Scottish-orientated political blogs such as Bella Caledonia, Wings Over Scotland, and indeed to a great extent the Craig Murray blog had to generate huge interest to make it into the UK top 10. Slugger O'Toole has achieved that from the even smaller home base of Northern Ireland. And he's done this by two techniques. Firstly, by having the command of the detail that any student of Northern Irish politics would require. The blog has become the leading source of the politics of the province. Secondly, in his original call to play the ball, not the man, Slugger O'Toole has created a safe space for people across the political, religious and constitutional divide to state their case. This allows an online conversation which is perhaps at its most necessary when the physical opportunities for contact are limited, such as now, with the Northern Irish Assembly suspended yet again. It is perhaps a lesson about the conduct of political discourse, which other forums well beyond Northern Ireland should follow. Over the next few weeks, and free of the necessary broadcasting requirements during an election period, we turn to some cracking topics. In next week's show, we survey the political landscape in the aftermath of the UK election test, which was never meant to happen, the European elections. The following week, we look at the changing politics of protest. 100 years ago, working-class Glasgow took to the streets in what the government of the day saw as an incipient Bolshevik revolution. A century later, the largely middle-class anti-HS2 protesters take to the boards in London's Camden People's Theatre, as they're doing this very week. In this case, the government might be about to cave in. And after all of that, we return to our series on political bloggers with an exclusive interview with one of the most controversial and successful of all Scottish bloggers in the genteel and beautiful surroundings of the ancient English city of Bath. But for now, from Alex, myself and all of the team here at the show, we hope to see you next week.